Today we're going to take another look at some of those old style bucktail jigs from the 60s and 70s. Stay tuned. So good morning. Today we're going to take a look at some of those older bucktail jigs that we've been tying the last couple videos. We're returning to the book How to Fish with Jigs again by Guy and Sace, and tie a jig from a jig pattern from that book called the Jig Fly. But before we get into that, I did want to show you something that I did find in my collection, and it was from a jig swap that I participated in, I'm guessing around 2013-ish. It was Jig Swap 23 from jigcraft.com, which is a website forum that's still up and running today. If you're interested in jig tying, it doesn't matter for what species of fish, saltwater, freshwater, smaller panfish, check out that website. It's an interesting bunch of guys. Many of these forums don't get much traffic anymore, just because of the nature of, we got YouTube and everything else now. But I believe this jig swap, which was number 36, was from 2016. So that's the jig that I'm going to tie, that I also tied from the How to Fish with Jigs book. Looking through all those old jigs, I found a couple tied by a guy that were just like the jigs we tied in our last video. Let me switch this over real quick so we can get a good show of this. So these were tied by Redman, and him and I have talked over the years about a few different things. This jig, he calls it a gemstone, and as you can see, just like the hairwing pike flies that we tied, it's got the Hackle tail with a chenille body, and he mimics the body color on the lower wing, so white chenille body with a white belly, and then he has the black and yellow top wing. And this is tied on that, what I would call a goby head, or maybe a boxing glove head, or a pear head. I don't really know what this head was called. I would love to find a mold for this. A lot of the older jigs were tied with this shape head. Along with that jig, he also sent me this one, and it shows a little bit of, I don't think this was fished with, I think this is just from sitting in a plastic bag for a decade. But again, that same style head, this with the very exaggerated eyes, the two hackles for the tails. He's got the bucktail extending all around the jig, though it's tied fairly sparse, so there is white bucktail on the sides covering that white chenille body. And then he's got two more barred hackle feathers as the top wing. I'll bet you this fished really well. This is a good looking jig. These were extras that he had sent me. He might have hoped that I fished with them, but I collect those types of things. And Redman has been a really interesting guy to talk to over the years. Super knowledgeable, especially with the old way of actually making the molds. So Here's his sample of the gemstone. I kept it in the bag. I didn't even take that one out. And these other two that he sent me are going right back in the Ziploc bag to save with the collection. So that was jig swap number 23. I can't remember who put that on. It could have been me. I could have put on that that particular swap. They all seem to be larger jigs for walleye and pike. So usually that's what the topic that I would want to tie for a swap. Other guys would like to do flies. Some guys would like to do streamers. Of course, a big portion of them would like to do panfish and crappie jigs, that type of thing. Super nice group of guys. Recently, the website had changed hands, but the content's only gotten better. You know, the layout and design, and it was one of the first jig tying forums that I was a member of, going, I don't know, probably 15 years now at least. But you can find some good information scrolling through some of the old forum topics. So definitely check them out, jigcraft.com. So from the How to Fish with Jigs book, they called this a jig fly. Now that term, I think, meant a couple different things. This could have been the pattern name. So as you can see, it's a yellow chenille wrapped with tinsel with a calf tail, a black top wing, and a yellow hackle that's been trimmed to just extend as the bottom wing. Like I said, they call it a jig fly, but I think that term was interchangeable. During the time period, like we're looking at late 60s, early 70s here. During that time period, the term jig fly could have been this particular pattern, but it was also just the term of a jig that had hair tied onto it. The same thing kind of happened, and I don't know if they happened in parallel or if one preceded the other, but also calling jigs bucktails. Bucktail, when I was a kid, when guys were referring to bucktails, you kind of had to figure out, are they talking about streamers or are they talking about weighted flies or jigs when they're talking about bucktails. Also in that conversation during that time period, so I'm, going back to some of my earliest memories. So early 70s, I was 4, 5, 6 years old by 72, 73, and so the term bucktail could have also meant a Carrie Stevens fly tied with feathers. But then, in the same sentence, they could interchange that, calling it a bucktail, calling it a streamer, calling it a tandem. So it's hard to nail down the names, I guess, is where we're getting at. So, in the How to Fish with Jigs book, we're going to tie the pattern that they call jig fly. But just to keep in mind that jig fly could just mean any type of weighted hook with hair tied on it. And that same idea of how the words change and how they're in parallel, thinking back again to those early years, and again, I'm 7, 8 years old. I'd stand around the table and listen to the guys talk, or we'd be in a bait shop and I'd listen to my dad talk to the shop owners and the old timers that are, the shop flies, the guys that hang out in the shop all day, every day, to get free coffee and tell lies, right? So they'd be talking and they'd talk about pike. Well, growing up, the term pike could have meant any type of fish that had teeth. So you kind of had to know the lake they're fishing. So up at Oneida Lake, when the guys are talking about, oh, I caught 3 pike this morning. Well, he was catching walleye. Go farther north to, I don't know, Black Lake. They're talking about pike. Well, they're probably talking about northern. And if we were in Chenille County, Long Pond, though that lake is known for muskie, I don't know if anybody's ever pulled a muskie out of there in the last 20 years. But if somebody said, oh yeah, I was in Chenille County catching pike, more than likely they were catching pickerel all day. So another one of those terms that just had so many different meanings, and it just depended on your general location, the lake you were fishing, the age of the guys that were talking. So when I'm talking to younger guys and they're talking about walleye fishing, we use the term walleye. If I was talking to somebody's grandfather and he's talking about a lake that had good pike, well, then I have to think about, well, what lake is he talking about? So one of those interesting things. So we're going to tie this on. It's a longer shank hook. I will look up the code for the Mustad hook. This is a Limerick hook, and I will put the actual hook number down below. But this head is I think what they call a boxing glove head. If somebody knows the actual name of this jig head and mold, let me know. It does appear that it had a rubber keeper point on it that was nipped off, but they left the collar, the lead collar. So we'll begin this jig. We'll lock the thread on about halfway down the shank and walk it with open wraps. They don't need to be terribly neat at this stage, to the point of the hook. We'll begin by adding the red calf tail, a small pinch. This isn't a big, I'm not putting on a wing, I'm just using a tail, using this for the tail. Marabou or turkey feather would also work very well as a tail. You could use a couple hackle tips also. Very nice, would work very well. Since this is a longer body hook shank, we're going to extend this two full lengths of the hook gap past the bend of the hook. So that's roughly to this last marking on my vise. Switch our grip. Keep this pinch tight. And just lock this on. There's 5 or 6 wraps towards the bend of the hook, and then walk the thread back to the point of the hook, and that will be locked on. Add a little bit of pressure and let that roll to the top, and the sides is fine. You don't have to extend that hair all the way around. We have a length of chenille. Well, let me get a longer piece. I don't know if that will make it a little bit longer. So we have a length of chenille, size medium. You'll notice we're not using any fluorescent colors in this jig, keeping the colors very plain and typical of, late 60s, early 70s for material choices. I removed some of the chenille, some of the fibers from the chenille, just to expose that thread core and lock that into place. And I can walk the thread back down just to the right of that bump. Next, we'll start with our Mylar tinsel. This is a modern material, or a fairly new material in terms of its age. Has a gold side and a silver side. We're going to use the silver side today. If you have some nice metal French tinsel, that would work awesome on this jig. I actually have some in my materials. I just didn't want to get it out for this jig. But I just cut a piece that's long enough to work with. And since we want to use the silver side, I will tie this in with the silver facing the shank of the hook. Just lock that on. A couple wraps towards the bend of the hook. And then we can walk the threads all the way back to the head of the jig. All the way to the head. At this point we can add a touch of head cement, just a small drop. Now, I don't go into much detail about this point at this stage. Adding the head cement does add a little bit of durability, particularly with the jigs that are layered. But my purpose is not to glue the jig together. We do add a little bit of durability with that small drop of head cement, but it's my perspective that if you're using head cement to glue your jigs together, then your technique in tying just isn't correct. You shouldn't have to glue your jigs together. We should be able to tie these and catch a whole bunch of fish with them with absolutely no head cement. Yes, they get worn out a little bit quicker, but then we can sit down and tie them again. So my first wrap with the chenille will be angled towards the bend of the hook, and as I come around, we can change the angle slightly so we can make touching wraps up the shank of the hook. Now these are going between the jaws of my vise and my bobbin. Touching wraps up the shank of the hook. As we get to the end, my last wrap as I come around, I'll angle the chenille to the outside of my bobbin. So when I switch hands and pick up my bobbin, I can add 4 quick wraps, and it's locked in place. For our tinsel, we're going to wrap it in an opposite direction. And again, going back to the comments about not gluing my jig together, and it's your technique and your tying that helps keep the jig together and provides the durability. So I'm going to wrap my tinsel the opposite direction, bringing it underneath the jig and wrapping it with open wraps up the shank of the hook. There's 4 on my 5th wrap around. After my 5th wrap, I'm going to bring the tinsel to the outside of my bobbin in a full rotation around the collar, and then I can just pick up my bobbin and lock that into place. At this stage, couple half hitches would be perfect. A drop, and I will just state a drop of head cement. I do recognize the fact that we are layering a jig and layering our materials. Though I think that people develop bad habits and really rely on the head cement to glue jigs together, when really you just need to pay attention to your technique. At this point, I'm going to rotate the jig just a half a turn so I can reach the bottom of this. And it is slightly out of frame. There we go. Now, we've rotated this around because we know that fishing this jig, this is the back of the jig. And we were going to take our sparse pinch of black bucktail. Remove some of the broken hairs and the fuzziness and the short layered hair, the short layer of hair. And then we switch our grip. We can stack by hand. That is terrible. Let's do this again. I'm not sure where I got this tail. There is a layer, and maybe I was getting it closer towards the center part of this tail. But there is a section on here that had an awful lot of broken pieces. And then here's the next pinch right next to it, and it seems fine. So I don't know if I got hit with the scissors by accident or what, but that first pinch, I did not like that. I do keep some of the mistakes. I am taking out the part where I tied the wings in upside down. We are retying this jig. So once we get our pinch, you know, I need to put my monitor closer, directly in front of me maybe, so I can see. Sometimes I think you miss what I'm doing just because I have the picture-in-picture and things like that. But let's keep tying. So I just rotated this up just so I can see. I want to measure the length of the body past the bend of the hook, which is going to be at least to the end of this silver part on my jaws of my vise. So that's the length I want. A couple short hairs, a couple crooked hairs. Thinning this out is okay. We want a fairly sparse pinch because we are adding this just as a wing. Rotate this back around. I know this is my length. Switch my grip and keep this nice and tight. Now I will hold this into place, and these first 3 wraps are going to be loose. So that's 3 wraps towards the bend of the hook, loose. As I come around, I'm going to pull straight up and then finish the wraps tight. I'm going to remove my hand now since it's locked on. Those loose wraps and then pulling straight up, what that does is pulls those wraps as you're pulling your bobbin straight up. It pulls those wraps straight down, so I'm not rotating the hair around the shaft of the hook at all. We want it to be just that back wing. Now I can rotate my vise back up, and I have a nice long streamer hackle, nice long fibers. We want these to be at least half the length of this black wing, at least 3/4 even would look nice. And I'm just feeling the stem of this hackle fiber. I don't want it too thick. When it gets to this section where I think it's starting to get a little thick, I'll trim that. You can save this. This is great tail material. for crappie jigs, so you can save those. And I strip the fibers just to leave myself a bit of the stem. You could snip and leave some of the pieces of those fibers. That gives the thread something to lock into. So this is curved towards me, so I will put the curve so it curves away from the stem of the jig. So it's curving towards me here. And just to lock this on, I'll angle it just slightly right at the side. There's 6 wraps to lock it on. This little stem, the stem of it, a couple wraps on the outside of the stem, sandwiching it between our threads, and then a couple wraps on the other side. So it's locked into place, it's not going anywhere. The little stem can stay right there. You don't have to trim it any shorter than that. And even though this is a long feather, I'll take my hackle pliers and depending on how bushy your hackle is will depend on how many wraps. For this one we'll do at least 3 to make a nice full collar, so that's 3 full rotations. My last rotation on the head side of that stem from the feather, and as I bring the last rotation of hackle around it, I take it to the outside of my bobbin, so when I switch hands and pick up my bobbin, I can angle my bobbin to rub the thread along the head of the jig. 4 wraps to lock that on. I can cut off my tip. This tip now is good. Again, you can save those. Those are good tail materials. I have a great big bushy collar. We're going to lock this into place and tie off our collar with a loop of size A thread of a different color. And again, when I pick up my bobbin, I'm angling it so the thread rides along the surface of the jig head. So I trap, I'm not going to say you never trap any of those fibers, but as little as possible. Trapping those fibers under your collar. Just pull this through. Before we add our head cement, so we can take a look at our jig, that's a nice, see as we fish this wing is going to flow backwards and make a nice belly wing. But to finish this, just take some of your smaller fly tying scissors and right at the lateral line, you're just going to nip those and then go around. Take a little bit of care, you don't want to get your black wing, your black bucktail. And this, the trimming of this, I am leaving, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch, 30 seconds worth of this yellow hackle around this section of the jig. It doesn't have to be trimmed. It doesn't have to be trimmed right up against your collar. So you can leave a little bit of fuzziness and just some, let it look natural. So this will look, that will look nice when you're fishing it. And now we can take our head cement, saturate those threads all the way around. Capillary action will draw itself into the different layers. of the thread. And there we go. So this is what they're calling a jig fly. And as we mentioned before, I'm not exactly sure if this is the pattern name or if it's just the fact that it is a jig. And they're still combining a couple different terms. You know, we're calling it a jig fly. So real nice. The white and red eye complements that the red tail and the yellow. It's a good looking fly. Nice long body on this, and probably why I chose the ball head with my original example from 2016. Because of the length of the hook shank as opposed to that goby head that I have, which is a really nice jig, but because of how the head itself extends down the shaft of the hook, it really limits that or reduces the body profile. So if you like what we did here today, go ahead and put some comments down below. I tried to read all the comments and respond the best I can. As always, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any new content. And until next time, keep tying tight lines.